The courtroom was silent. A 14-year-old girl, Madison, walked in, her wrists stiff from the weight of the oversized orange jumpsuit. The fabric clung to her like a label she hadn't chosen, but one that had already decided her fate in most people's eyes. At the front of the room, Judge Robert Harrison sighed and adjusted his glasses. He didn't even look at her as he shuffled papers, his expression unreadable. To him, this was just another case, another file on his desk. To her right, Prosecutor David Barnes smirked, straightening his already perfect tie. He had done this 1,000 times before, and in his mind, this case was already won. The jury members barely glanced at her. They sat back, relaxed, uninterested. No one in that room expected a fight. But what they didn't know was that before this trial was over, everything they believed about justice would be questioned. Friends, before I share today's episode, I want to tell you an interesting stat. 99% of the people who watch our content enjoy it, but they haven't subscribed to our channel yet. If you're one of those 99%, all you need to do is a small task. Just look below this video, you'll see a subscribe button. All you have to do is click that subscribe button. It's as simple as that. And if you want, you can also press the bell icon so that you're the first to know whenever we upload a new video. Now, let's dive into the video. A 14-year-old girl walked into court facing a felony, but by the time she left, the judge and prosecutor were the ones on trial. Stay till the end, this case will make you question everything you know about justice. The courtroom felt colder than it should have been, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the way people looked at her, some with indifference, some with doubt, and a few with outright suspicion. Madison sat at the defendant's table, her hands resting in her lap. Her fingers barely twitched, but inside her heart pounded. The orange jumpsuit felt heavy on her shoulders, as if it was pressing down on her, trying to shrink her into something smaller. But she wouldn't let it. Across the room, Judge Robert Harrison sighed loudly, tapping his fingers on the desk. His expression was tired, impatient, like this entire proceeding was nothing more than an inconvenience. He adjusted his glasses but never looked at Madison. To his right, Prosecutor David Barnes stood, straightened his tie and smirked. He loved cases like this, open and shut. A young defendant, no real legal defense, and a courtroom already assuming guilt. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly, making sure everyone heard every word. The state of Tennessee versus Madison. Felony theft. A $12,000 sapphire necklace. Destruction of security property. A murmur ran through the small crowd behind her. Madison didn't turn to see who was there. She knew what they were thinking. A 14-year-old charged with a felony? She must have done something. At her side, defense attorney Mark Reynolds barely lifted his head. His suit was wrinkled, his papers scattered across the table. He flipped through them lazily, as if trying to remember what this case was even about. Madison glanced at him. Was he even going to try? The weight of everything pressed down on her, but she kept her chin up. Her grandfather always told her never show fear. So she wouldn't. Not here, not now. She stayed silent, watching everything, waiting. Prosecutor David Barnes took a slow step forward, smoothing his tie, eyes locked on the judge. His voice was steady, confident, like a man who had already won. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the jury as he continued. The defendant was caught on surveillance footage at Jackson & Company Jewelry, just minutes before the store's alarm was triggered. The footage shows a girl in a hoodie reaching into a display case. Moments later, the store's entire security system was disabled, and a sapphire necklace worth $12,000 disappeared. Madison kept her breathing even. She had heard this before. We also have a witness who saw the defendant running away from the scene, Barnes added, his smirk widening. The words lingered in the air, heavy and damning. Judge Harrison barely looked up. Defense, do you have a response? There was a pause. Madison turned to her lawyer. Mark Reynolds cleared his throat, finally lifting his head from his scattered papers. He adjusted his glasses, shifted in his seat, and stood up slowly. Your Honor, my client is just a kid, he said, his voice lacking conviction. Silence. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, unimpressed. Do you have an actual argument, Mr. Reynolds? Or are you just pointing out her age? Reynolds hesitated, flipped through his notes. Madison clenched her fists in her lap. Her lawyer had nothing. He wasn't going to fight for her. The truth hit her hard. If she wanted to prove her innocence, she would have to do it herself. She took a slow breath, lifted her chin, and spoke for the first time. "Show the footage." The room fell silent. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Madison didn't hesitate. She turned her head, looking directly at Barnes. "The footage. Play it." The prosecutor's smirk faltered just for a second. Then he nodded at the bailiff. A screen on the courtroom wall flickered to life. The evidence that was supposed to prove her guilt was about to be tested. The screen flickered to life, displaying the grainy black and white footage from inside the jewelry store. The room went silent as everyone turned to watch. A girl in a hoodie stood at the counter. Her face was barely visible hidden beneath the hood. The camera angle was bad, the quality worse. But the way the prosecution spoke about this footage, you'd think it was undeniable proof. The girl reached into the display case. A few seconds later, the lights in the store flickered off. The alarm triggered. Then the girl turned and ran. Madison leaned forward. Her eyes locked on the screen, her breathing steady. She watched every movement, every shadow, every tiny detail. And then she saw it. "Pause it." The sudden command startled the courtroom. Judge Harrison frowned. "What?" Madison pointed at the screen. "Right there, pause it." The bailiff hesitated, but did as she said. The frozen frame showed the girl's hand, reaching for the necklace. Madison stood up. "Look at her left hand." People in the jury squinted, leaning forward. The judge sighed. "What about it?" Madison lifted her hands, turning them so everyone could see. "She's wearing a ring. I don't wear rings." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Mark Reynolds, her own lawyer, blinked in surprise. He hadn't noticed that. Barnes let out a short laugh. "That's circumstantial." Madison ignored him. She kept her eyes on the screen. Rewind 5 seconds. The bailiff hesitated again, glancing at the judge. Harrison waved a hand. "Let's see where she's going with this." The footage rewound. Madison pointed again. "Her shoes." Everyone stared. Madison tilted her head. "They're too big, and if you watch closely, she walks differently than I do." Barnes rolled his eyes. "This is ridiculous." Madison didn't even look at him. She turned to the jury. "If you compare this footage to the video from when I was arrested, you'll see a difference." A few jurors shifted in their seats. They were paying attention now. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers. For the first time, he actually looked at Madison. And for the first time, he wasn't just seeing a defendant. He was seeing someone who just might be telling the truth. The room had changed. The quiet murmurs among the jury. The way the judge sat up just a little straighter. The way even Prosecutor Barnes adjusted his tie, his smirk fading. For the first time, people weren't just looking at Madison as a suspect. They were actually listening. Judge Harrison exhaled through his nose, lacing his fingers together as he studied her. Then a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You've got a sharp eye, Madison. But this isn't a game of spot the difference. You're on trial for felony theft." She met his stare. "I know." A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery. The jury exchanged glances. Harrison leaned forward. "Tell me something, Madison. You seem to know a lot about this case. Let's see if you know about the law, too." Madison didn't blink. "Go ahead." Harrison tilted his head slightly. "Who holds the burden of proof in a criminal case?" She didn't hesitate. "The prosecution." A few jurors nodded slightly, as if they'd just remembered the same rule. Barnes shifted in his seat. The judge tapped his fingers. "And what's the standard?" "Beyond a reasonable doubt." Harrison raised his eyebrows. Even Madison's lawyer, Mark Reynolds, looked surprised. It was like he was realizing for the first time that his client knew more about the law than he did. Barnes scoffed. "Cute. She memorized a couple of legal terms." Harrison ignored him. His smirk grew. "All right, Miranda v. Arizona. Tell me its significance." Madison tilted her head slightly, then spoke with confidence. "Miranda writes." But it wasn't just about that. The case was about police coercion and the Fifth Amendment. If a suspect isn't informed of their rights before questioning, their confession can't be used in court. This time, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. One of the jurors, a woman in her 50s, leaned forward slightly. watching Madison more intently. Barnes's jaw clenched. His confidence was slipping. Judge Harrison sat back, crossing his arms. Huh. That was all he said. But in that moment, everyone in the courtroom knew what it meant. She had gotten his attention. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Prosecutor Barnes stood up and adjusted his tie. His confidence had been rattled, but he wasn't giving up. Not yet. The state calls Dennis Parker to the stand. A nervous-looking man in his late 50s shuffled inside. He wiped his palms on his slacks before taking a seat at the witness stand. His shoulders were stiff, his face pale. Judge Harrison eyed him. "State your name for the record." Dennis Parker." The man cleared his throat. Barnes smiled, regaining his composure. He walked toward the witness stand, hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Parker, you were working at Jackson & Company Jewelry the night of the incident, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And did you see the defendant in or near the store that evening?" Dennis hesitated for a brief second. Then he nodded. I believe I did." Barnes glanced toward the jury, giving them a confident nod. "Can you confirm it was her?" Dennis shifted in his seat. His fingers tapped lightly against the stand. "I mean, it looked like her. Same height, same build. She had a hoodie on, and when she ran out, I only saw her for a second." Barnes smirked and turned toward the judge. "No further questions." He walked back to his table, looking satisfied. But Madison wasn't done. She turned toward Judge Harrison. "Can I ask him something?" The judge leaned back in his chair. He let out a small sigh, then nodded. "Go ahead." Madison stood. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't nervous. She was focused. She turned to Dennis Parker. "Mr. Parker, you said the person you saw was wearing a hoodie, right?" Dennis nodded. "Yes." Madison tilted her head. "What color was it?" Dennis blinked. Gray, I think." A few jurors raised their eyebrows. Madison turned to the jury. "But the footage shows black." Barnes shot up from his seat. "Objection! The witness is recalling details from memory. Minor inconsistencies don't discredit his statement." Judge Harrison waved him off. "Overruled. Continue." Madison faced Dennis again. "And where were you standing when you saw this person?" Dennis fumbled slightly. "By the register." Madison nodded. "So that means the person was already outside when you got a look at them." Dennis hesitated. "Yeah, I guess." Madison's eyes didn't waver. "Did you actually see them take anything?" The room went silent. Dennis Parker swallowed. His fingers tapped against the stand again. "Number." The jury exchanged glances. More murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Madison turned to the jury again, her voice calm but firm. "So you saw someone outside running. You assumed they took something, but you never actually saw them steal anything, and the color of the hoodie doesn't match." She paused. Let the silence stretch. Then she tilted her head slightly. "Would you bet my freedom on that?" Dennis swallowed hard. Barnes gritted his teeth. He could feel the case slipping from his hands. The jury was no longer looking at Madison like a criminal. They were looking at Barnes, and they were starting to doubt him. The courtroom was shifting. The jury, once indifferent, was now watching closely. The whispers in the gallery had stopped. Everyone was locked in, hanging on to every word. But Prosecutor Barnes wasn't done yet. He refused to let a 14-year-old make a fool of him. He scoffed, shaking his head as if this was all a joke. Then he turned to Madison and let out a sarcastic chuckle. "All right, let's say you're right. Let's say the footage isn't clear. The witness was mistaken. That still doesn't change the fact that a crime happened." He gestured toward the jury, his voice rising. "A $12,000 necklace was stolen. If she didn't do it, then who did?" Madison didn't flinch. She simply raised an eyebrow and tilted her head slightly. Then she said the 5 words that changed everything. "That's not my job. It's yours." Silence. Judge Harrison exhaled sharply. He adjusted his glasses, staring at Barnes. The prosecutor opened his mouth to argue, then shut it again. Because Madison was right. The burden of proof wasn't on her, it was on them. The jury saw it. The courtroom saw it. And now Barnes saw it too. His case was falling apart. Barnes clenched his jaw. He was losing control. He took a deep breath and straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. "This is all very clever," he said, forcing a smile. "But let's not forget the facts. The necklace is still missing. He turned to the jury, his voice dripping with forced confidence. We don't need the stolen necklace to prove theft. Madison smirked. She tilted her head slightly, as if she had been waiting for him to say that. Actually, you do. Barnes blinked. Excuse me? She leaned forward. Theft means taking something. If you don't have what was stolen, how do you know I had it? Barnes's mouth twitched. Silence. The jury exchanged glances. Judge Harrison leaned forward. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. Counselor, do you have any material evidence tying the defendant to the stolen property? Barnes hesitated. His face turned red. We have the surveillance footage. That doesn't clearly show her. Harrison cut him off. Barnes's lips parted, but no words came out. Madison let the silence stretch. Then she turned to the jury. So let me get this straight. She lifted her hands slightly, as if laying out the facts for them. You want to send a 14-year-old to juvenile detention based on a bad video and a witness who wasn't sure, with no stolen property, no fingerprints, no DNA, no real evidence. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was calm, controlled, powerful. Barnes gritted his teeth. We have enough. Madison let the words hang in the air. Then she tilted her head. Do you? The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone knew the answer. Judge Harrison sighed heavily. He removed his glasses, rubbing his forehead. The jury will deliberate. A bailiff escorted the jury out of the room. The door clicked shut. Madison stayed frozen in her seat. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but she clenched them into fists. She wouldn't let anyone see. Beside her, her grandfather reached over and squeezed her hand. She exhaled slowly. Minutes passed, then an hour. The room buzzed with quiet whispers, but Madison didn't move. Then the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman stood. Madison's heart pounded. We, the jury, find the defendant. A pause. A breath. Not guilty. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Madison didn't move. Not at first. Because she had spent so long expecting the worst that she wasn't sure how to process this. Barnes's face stiffened. He slammed his file shut, jaw tight, eyes hard. Judge Harrison nodded. The defendant is free to go. It was over. The air outside the courthouse felt different. Lighter, warmer. But Madison still hadn't fully processed what had happened. She stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold press of reality settling against her skin. Her grandfather walked beside her. His movements were slow, but his presence was steady, just like it had been throughout the trial. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Madison broke the silence. They wanted to lock me up, over nothing. Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. Her grandfather nodded, looking straight ahead. No, he said simply. They didn't see it as nothing. She swallowed. I wasn't even there. They didn't care. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Her eyes burned. What if I didn't know how to fight back? Her grandfather let out a slow breath, his face unreadable. Then you would have lost. That truth hung between them. Madison hated it. But then he gave her a small nod. Unless people like you make sure that changes. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, past the courthouse, past everything behind her. And for the first time she realized something. She hadn't just walked away from a trial. She was walking towards something bigger. Because today, she had defended herself. But tomorrow, she might be defending someone else. The justice system isn't built to be fair to everyone. Cases like Madison's happen more often than we think. But knowing your rights can be the difference between freedom and conviction. If this story made you think, share it, talk about it, and most importantly, learn the law. Because the more you know, the harder it is for the system to work against you. Subscribe for more stories that challenge what we think we know about justice.